everyone, and welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Dr. Corey Wallace, who will be presenting on Japan's security transformation, Why Now? Dr. Wallace is Associate Professor at Kanagawa University in the Faculty of Foreign Languages at the Minato Mirai campus in Yokohama. He was previously Einstein Foundation Visiting Fellowship postdoctoral researcher at the Graduate School of East Asian Studies at the Freie University of Berlin. He completed his Master's of Arts in Political Science from the University of Canterbury in 2004 before spending 3 years on the Japan Exchange Teaching, which is the JET program, in Fukushima Prefecture. On his return to New Zealand, he worked at the Ministry of Research, Science and Technology as a policy advisor. He received his PhD in International Relations and Politics from the University of Auckland in 2015. Dr. Wallace's academic publications on regional geopolitics and Japan security policy have been featured in International Relations of Asia Pacific, the Pacific Review, and Asian Perspectives, and Chapman House International Affairs. Dr. Wallace, it is a pleasure to have you with us here today, and I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thank you very much. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, so thank you very much for attending my talk today. So as advertised, we'll be talking about the issue of Japan's security policy transformation. So perhaps more than many other countries, there's a lot to talk about in terms of this idea of transformation, because as people probably know, Japan has had a very interesting history with its own military. And in particular, after World War II, the issue of military restraint has stood out. So when we talk about Japan's security policy, rather than strategy or doctrine, we have to talk about military restraints placed on Japan's security policy. So Japan lacks the same degree of flexibility as many other countries do when it comes to policy and strategy making in this area. So what we mean by military restraint, we will get to in a minute precisely, but I want to sort of start off this presentation by introducing 4 lenses that academics often use to interpret policy change, especially in Japan's case. So these 4 lenses here, I will touch upon each of them going through this presentation. But just to sort of give you an indication at the outset, here's the 4 I will use today. So these are not mutually exclusive from each other. And you can cut and divide these in many different ways if you like to, but this is how I generally approach the topic. So let's start off with the idea of identity and ideology. So Japan's post-war identity has been one of a peace nation. People often say pacifist. I'm not sure if that's quite right, but at least as a peace nation, this has been a popularly embraced identity for many in the public and even within the political realm. And so this is a Japan that's restrained by a war-renouncing Article 9 in the peace constitution, as many people call it. It's employed peace diplomacy overseas rather than, I guess, what it did prior to World War II, during World War II. It's focused on economic growth, development at home and abroad. So this is a particularly important aspect. This has been centered in Japan's security policy, as well as its diplomacy. And it's been protected, or, depending on your point of view, limited by the US-Japan alliance. Okay, so these are the basic ideas or precepts underpin this sort of peace nation identity and approach. Now, a lot of speculation, both in the media and even amongst many academics, has been, how much does pacifism continue to define Japan's security orientation? And, we often see in the media in particular, frequent reports or almost warnings of Japan moving away from pacifism. And this often brings up the issue of, well, if Japan is moving away from so-called pacifism, what comes after? Now, some may say Japan is just simply becoming more normal, more realistic about the world that's around it. And some people see this as a positive and a negative. Some may say that Japan's becoming more nationalistic. Of course, this has certain sort of nuances to it, and it depends who's talking about it. Some see this as obviously a very bad thing, potentially a dangerous thing. While others are like, well, look, nationalism or patriotism at least is a natural and normal thing that many countries have. And there's also been a lot of speculation about generational change, and especially as we get further and further from the war and the not just experience of the war, but experience of the rebuilding after the war and the stories there told by many people. This generational change is actually the focus of my PhD and also a book I'm writing, but I won't talk about that today, if people want me to. So anyway, in terms of what I meant by this idea of moves away from pacifism, I just last night looked this up, found it straight away from Le Monde. This idea that it's moving away from an ideal, it's doubled its budget, and it's drifting from the stance enshrined in its constitution, okay? Another one I found, Japan is moving to remilitarize despite its pacifist constitution, which makes things sound a little bit contradictory and incoherent in some ways, maybe even slightly disingenuous. Now, I don't generally speaking, this is not my favorite narrative used, but there is something to be said for the idea that there are a number of actors in Japan that have emphasized this need to get out from, Japan's abnormal position, right? So the post-war, it had a certain, Japan had to accept the surrender and had to accept the occupation and to a certain degree the constitution and so forth. But that is no longer a normal state of being for Japan. And there are many political actors in particular who believe this. So what that would mean is that we would need to get rid of Article 9, so to speak, for Japan to have a normal military. We would have to go from self-defense capabilities to power projection capabilities, maybe even offensive ones, if Japan is going to reclaim the status of a so-called tier 1 power. And the US-Japan alliance is also a focus of this idea. So how does Japan go from being more of a junior partner to an equal partner, or a partner that can at least defend itself? And an important part of this is, how does Japan go beyond the shield and spear division in the alliance, where Japan is the shield and the US is the sharper, the more offensive spear, able to met out punishment. So this lens in terms of ideology and identity can be very useful in many ways to sort of look at the long arc of history, I guess you could say. But I don't always necessarily find it that useful, because it sort of gives a sense of, it indicates that there should be much more rapid changes than there have been in Japan's security policy. Okay, and we can get back to that if you like. So anyway, the second lens that we can use is in terms of strategic dilemmas. Okay, this is very simple. I'll simplify this very greatly. In political science and international relations, we often talk about a security dilemma. Now, there are people who do game theory and they make this very complicated and whatnot. I will not do that. But basically, the security dilemma is very simple. State A takes a certain action to address its insecurity, usually building up its military, an alliance relationship, something. This causes other states to react in some way. This results in states A's insecurity not actually being addressed, or potentially in some cases even being worsened. So this is the security dilemma, and every state has to deal with this. Japan is no exception, of course. But within the security dilemma, we have another one, which we call the alliance security dilemma. Okay, and this one is particularly a big deal for Japan because the US-Japan alliance has been such a prominent part of its, frankly, its security policy since World War II. So in this case, actions taken by an alliance partner generally present risks to the other partners. Okay, so in Japan's case, something the United States does presents a risk. Now, this risk can either result in a fear of abandonment, or it can result in a fear of entrapment. Okay, and so depending on which one it is, the original state, Japan in this case, will seek assurance from a partner if it's abandonment fear, or it will seek to isolate itself from the impact of the partner's actions if it's an entrapment fear. So I'll give a more concrete, sort of go into a little bit more concrete discussion of this. But in terms of Japan's post-war security, alliance security dilemma, it's varied over time. And so this is why I don't necessarily like the sort of linear way of looking at security change, because sometimes Japan feels entrapment, or Tokyo does in terms of the government, and sometimes it fears abandonment. It depends on the situation. During the Trump administration, for example, it was quite a feat actually. He managed to make people in Tokyo fear both abandonment and entrapment at the same time, which is quite something to do. But anyway, when we talk about Japan, we have to go back to the original, how should we say, bargain that underpinned the US-Japan alliance, going back to the 1952 treaty. So basically, Japan and the United States came to an agreement about essentially swapping bases for people. The Japanese government wanted protection while rebuilding, but it didn't want full entanglement in a so-called equal alliance where they would have mutual obligations to each other. And so why was this? It's a good place to start. And I guess if we was to really simplify it down, it would be American wars, okay? So let me explain what this means. When we talk about the entrapment fear, entrapment in the alliance, there was always originally a worry that Japan would be requested to remilitarize rapidly and maybe even send troops overseas to fight in so-called American wars. And this becomes more understandable when you think about how the Japanese public was more reticent and sensitive to this issue than many other countries. Every country is concerned about this entrapment fear, but in Japan's case, especially after World War II, this sensitivity was all the more, all the stronger for various reasons. And even today, this idea of so-called American wars is kind of used as a shorthand in the debate. And so what exactly is a so-called American war? Basically, a wars of choice where the US intervenes and potentially worsens the situation. Not all US interventions do this, of course, but there have, of course, been many. And in particular, possible wars or fears of wars that may happen due to overeager US foreign policy goals, strategies, and so forth. And wars that threaten to drain the nation of natural resources, blood and treasure, as people often put it, court disaster, right? And so the key thing here is that these so-called American wars pop up from time to time. So the two best examples were Vietnam and the Iraq wars. And in some ways, all three of these renewed entrapment fears. Okay, so this is what I mean. It's not really a linear process. An action taken by an alliance partner can at any particular point in time raise the fear of entrapment or abandonment. Now, in terms of understanding today, you might be asking, well, don't we hear that there's greater willingness in Tokyo and Japan in general to get involved in regional security? And I think that's generally correct. And I would say that to some degree, this is due to the changing salience and the dynamics of the entrapment and abandonment fears themselves. So what I mean by that is this idea of so-called American wars in the past was based on the idea of, or assumption of, US military dominance. And the US as having primary agency to not necessarily do what it wants, but to basically control escalation and so forth. And so there was, for many decades, discussion where that if even in the Far East, even around Japan itself, if there was a conflict on the Korean Peninsula around Taiwan, who would be the military power driving that? Who would be responsible for provocations? And many, not all, but many people in both the political and the political sphere and the public came to the conclusion that at times it was the United States that was driving this provocation. Whether that's the case or not is up for debate, but this was the perception. But you can ask quite reasonably, is this still the case today? Would a second Korean War or a Taiwan conflict be mostly attributable to American actions? Or would it be due to the DPRK or the People's Republic of China? And my view, and this can be debated, is that most Japanese today are more likely to locate agency in these other actors, okay? Not so much the United States as the cause of any potential war that might happen. But of course, this depends on the details and also depends on the region. I think in Japan, there's still a relatively dim view of US actions taken in the Middle East, and there's a very strong sense that Japan doesn't want to get involved in anything over there. Taiwan, on the other hand, I think recently it's started to change a bit. I think there's a greater perception that if there's any Taiwan conflict, it would probably be, the agency would be located with China. Korean Peninsula, likewise, I think the same thing here with the DPRK. South China Sea, that one's a little bit tricky. I think it's somewhere possibly in the middle. That one is very much of a depends. But I guess my point here is that this idea of entrapment is no longer so strongly connected to the idea of American wars being a big problem in the Far East, so to speak, or East Asia, as we say today. So that, to some degree, I think explains why the Japanese are much more willing to at least talk about things like Japanese self-defense forces helping in North Korean Peninsula, around Taiwan, and so forth. Okay, third one. Threat perception. So this one's pretty straightforward, I guess. Unsurprisingly, an important driver of change. We can go through a number of things to see and locate why Japan has decided to relax or loosen the military restraints. So one of them has been maritime security has been actually a bit of a constant since World War II. Well, the main reason is that one of the key lessons Japan learned from the United States and its defeat was the importance of maritime security, being able to defend your sea lanes, denying control of choke points to an adversary, anti-submarine warfare, and the importance of that were all big lessons that Japan took away from that. So even as it dialed down, I guess you could say, the ability to invade other countries and project power onto the mainland of other countries, maritime security has always remained a constant. So any sense of insecurity on the ocean has generally resulted in some kind of change in Japanese security policy. Korean War, we go back 1950s, that had a reasonably big impact in temporarily increasing support for Japan to have its own military. China in the mid-1960s, during the Cultural Revolution and the testing of a nuclear weapon, that raised some hackles in Tokyo. A big one was the Soviet Union in the late 70s and early 1980s. There was a buildup in the Far East, and the Soviet Union Pacific Navy also started to modernize and become much more active. And so this was one of the things that actually got Japan and China to sort of normalize their relations in the 70s and 1980s was a mutual fear of the Soviet Union. In the 90s, we can locate the DPRK and its missile and nuclear testing, and China's increasing acquisition of naval power projection capabilities. And then in the 2010s, we can reverse this. And I would say China is now sort of in front seat, so to speak, as the perceived #1 threat in Japan, perhaps even more than the DPRK. And then finally, it's really important to talk about Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, because that sort of connects to, the issue of why now? Why are we hearing a lot more talk about Japan's security transformation? And as you can see here, this is from Japan Institute of International Affairs and Chicago Council, but both China's and Russia's territorial ambitions are considered to be possible threats to Japan's vital interests over the next 10 years, according to the public. So to get to the fourth lens, political institutional adaptation. So this is where I'm going to talk about what precisely is Japanese military restraint, and what do we mean when we say that Japan's so-called pacifist policy is changing. And so let's start with some sort of terminology here. And so we often sort of have this, especially in the media, this sort of toggling idea of Japan moving straight from militarism to pacifism overnight. Now, if we look at the history really carefully, that's clearly not what happened for various reasons. But in general, long story short, academics prefer to talk about anti-militarism, in particular anti-militarist institutions in Japan, rather than some sort of ideological pacifism. Because if you go back and you look at, even public surveys in the 1950s, you'd be quite surprised at how open people were to things like changing the constitution, to rebuilding a military with, and calling it a military as such, various things like that. So I don't really buy this idea of a sort of ideological pacifism being that strong amongst the general public. Of course, on the left of the political spectrum, there are many so-called true believers, but I've always found it a little bit easier to sort of think about Japan's military restraint through the lens of anti-militarism and institutions. So what do I mean by this? Okay, so just a few things first. This anti-militarism actually took time to bed down. So it didn't happen overnight. You could argue it actually took about a good 30 years or so. And one of the key drivers for this was reassurance for both domestic and foreign audiences. Because both people at home and abroad were still a little bit unsure of what kind of Japan were they getting as Japan became economically and technologically more powerful. And so, excuse me, Japan's anti-militarism after World War II was more of a process of political compromise internally, as well as diplomatic compromise externally, as Japan tried to rebuild itself, rehabilitate itself, and eventually keep a form of democracy as it has done so, despite all its interesting sort of features. And ultimately, above all, the LDP did what it needed to do to remain dominant. So if that required them to make some concessions, introduce certain military restraints, even symbolic ones, it would do so, as it needed to, I guess, to essentially make sure the left in Japan didn't really seize power in any meaningful way. So what do I mean by this slow process of anti-militarist restraint? I think you can identify three key waves where we saw this anti-militarism actually kind of compounded and embedded in the Japanese political institutions. I did have a nice nuanced discussion of all three waves, but we don't have the time for that. So instead, I'm going to head on to just describing what those restraints were and how they were later salami sliced, to borrow phrase from my mentor, Professor Dick Samuels. So anyway, anti-militarist strengthening was a process. It wasn't a conversion overnight from militarism to pacifism. And so what do we mean by that? Well, the very first and maybe most important was this idea of no war potential. Okay, so this is written in the Constitution, and it has not been changed. Article 9 was, however, reinterpreted, firstly by this man in the picture, Yoshida Shigeru, to allow Japan to have a self-defense force. But it had to be a self-defense force without, quote unquote, war potential. Okay? That means Japan has to keep its capabilities limited to the minimum necessary for self-defense. And the use of those capabilities also has to be kept to the minimum necessary for dealing with an attack on Japan, especially when there's no other option available. Okay, and so war potential has been translated in many ways, but essentially it basically means the ability to threaten, destroy, and invade another country. So you can see this in his Article 9 of the Constitution. The first paragraph is somewhat pro forma. It's a very similar to the language of the United Nations Charter. But what's really unique about Japan's constitution is the second paragraph. And that is this idea that land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. And so if you read this in a very straightforward way, you'd be like, well, shouldn't Japan should have no, self-defense forces or forces of any particular kind, military kind. But this has actually been reread, reinterpreted. In many ways, the language in this has a lot of connections to international law that's allowed reinterpretations. And essentially, long story short again, it's been interpreted that as long as Japan can have a military that does not possess war potential that can be used to threaten another country, to destroy the civilian infrastructure of another country, or invade another country, then it should be able to have a self-defense capability. Okay, so that was the key, I guess you could say, military restraint. But from this grew a number of other restraints. So no self-defense forces overseas from 1954 to basically 1991. None for United Nations peacekeeping operations, none for collective security, which is the United Nations, none for disaster relief. And this was all in addition to the constitutional ban on combat dispatch. Okay, so I'll come back to that maybe at the end if we have time. But this was an optional and additional restraint to the constitutional restraints. Likewise, the idea of no self-defense integration with foreign militaries. So there was the avoidance of collective self-defense, which was sort of debated as a constitutional issue with some difficulty over time, but it's also included the avoidance of many other entanglements. So, for example, explicit joint training, command, certainly not any sort of sense of joint command. Many things that other militaries might do with their alliance partner were kind of, there was a firewall erected in between the self-defense forces and the US military here. Okay, so another one was bureaucratic and legal control. The self-defense forces have put many institutional and legal restraints on their activities, on the way they organize their command, how they consulted with ministers, how they even interacted with the public. The reason for this is that it was a very strong sensitivity to political manipulation of the military or vice versa in Japan. Okay, so in a strange way, after World War II, there wasn't civilian control so much as bureaucratic control of Japan's military. Non-military bureaucrats from Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Economy Ministry, etc., were essentially in charge of the military as such. So this was a kind of a unique feature of Japan's post-war security policy. And in particular was the self-defenses law itself. And this is, I think, an underappreciated limitation on Japan's use of the military as a security tool. Because in most countries, the military legislation operates on the basis of a negative list approach, right? So basically, as long as it's not explicitly prohibited, you can kind of do what you need to do under civilian control, of course, right? So in the Japan's case, from the start, the self-defenses law is a positive list approach, which means is based on a positive list approach, which means the self-defense forces can only do what is explicitly prescribed in the legislation itself. So that's why every time Japan wants to make a change, it's not simply a matter of a cabinet decision or the Ministry of Defense making a decision. But in many cases, they have to go through a legislative process to okay any given action. So this kind of, I guess you could say, undermines the flexibility that any Japan's leaders have when they want to use the military. Now, some of the more well-known ones, things like Japan's nuclear weapons, often called a nuclear weapons allergy. In the 50s, Japan wanted nuclear energy. The leaders wanted nuclear energy. People asked the question, what about nuclear weapons? Is this a path to Japan acquiring nuclear weapons? The government said, nope, we're going to make a law. We're only going to have peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But then in the 1960s, the issue came up again. And this time, the government, the LDP, was quite, again, being pragmatic, symbolically announced something called the 3 non-nuclear principles. Okay. 2 of these were pretty obvious based on the first point, no possession or no production by Japan. But a third point was added, which was no introduction into Japan by others. That is, no introduction to Japan by the United States, essentially. And this was already kind of an issue. People suspected that this was happening anyway, but also Okinawa was being discussed as the reversion of Okinawa was also being discussed. And it was well known that the US at the time kept tactical nuclear weapons in Okinawa, and that at the time, the military was probably a little bit resistant of removing them. But in Japan, there was a strong public urge and desire to achieve reversion of Okinawa on it was called Hondonami, the same basis as what the mainland was. So Okinawa couldn't have a special status. And so public pressure won out in the end. Japan, the Prime Minister Sato announced the 3 non-nuclear principles. Japan also signs the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, ratifies in 1970, and then in 1971 applies the 3 non-nuclear principles to Okinawan reversion. At about the same time, we start to see a strengthening of Japan's other restrictions. So for example, Japan actually played a leading role in the United Nations Outer Space Treaty, which was completed in 1967. And this basically limits the use of space to so-called peaceful purposes. Now, for most countries, that means non-aggressive purposes, which is why we don't have all sorts of weird and wonderful and wacky and very dangerous space weapons today. But most countries interpret it as allowing defensive uses, defensive military uses, such as, of course, tracking, surveillance. Today we have GPS. But Japan, when it established its space agency, actually went one step further and actually limited itself to non-military use of space and space research. So again, another self-imposed restraint here. Likewise, arms export restrictions. This was already in place during the occupation because there was worries about Japan exporting to the communist bloc. But Japan itself started to increase and expand the restrictions to include many various countries, including non-communist but problematic allies of the US, and eventually in 1976 to the United States itself. Okay, and then finally, the other thing we mean when we talk about military restraint is defense spending, and in particular, the 1% cap of GDP. So here, Japan's defense spending fell below 1% in 1967, was reiterated as an informal cap in 1972 during talks with China about normalization. And then in 1976, the cabinet itself actually passes a decision to limit Japan's spending to 1% of GDP. And this was at an interesting time when a new document came out called the National Defense Program Guidelines. And the idea promulgated within this is that Japan would have a basic defense force. The self-defense forces would have a basic defense force that was appropriate for peacetime, such. And, you know, the National Defense Program Guidelines are important in many ways. A, to rationalize defense planning on an annual basis, but also it was sort of a, I guess you could say, a low profile way of getting consensus across the political spectrum and buy-in from the Japanese public, and therefore to limit objections by opposition parties. So that was the ostensible purposes, the intended purposes. But a number of Japanese academics have, good colleague Chijiwa in particular, talked about how this new document was actually not meant to clarify strategy, but was actually meant to minimize defense commitments itself. And the way it did that is by even more firmly ensconcing Japan within the US-Japan treaty framework, and in particular, limiting Japan's, the self-defense forces development to that of a peacetime force capable of repelling limited and small-scale aggression only. So what that means is that the self-defense force and the planning around it would not be to counter specific threats, but to avoid Japan becoming a power vacuum, a sort of a, you know, an easy win, so to speak. The absolute minimum that Japan would need to present a barrier to the Soviet Union if it was going to invade. So in other words, the balance of power and threat assessments would not at least explicitly guide Japan's defense planning. And so this was a very interesting document promoted at the time in the mid-1970s, when Japan could have very easily, with its technological capabilities, become a true great military power should it have wanted to. But instead, what we have is Japan in the mid-1970s reaching some kind of anti-militarist peak. But as I said, not all these things are necessarily linear. And so we start to see this process of salami slicing from the 1980s. Okay, so I'll try and get through this as quick as possible. But basically, as these restraints were no longer, as assurance was accomplished, or they were just no longer needed or useful, they were essentially sliced away one by one. And the US-Japan defense guidelines in the late 70s, especially in response to concerns about the Soviet Union's presence in East Asia, was a very important turning point, and it increased training and familiarity between US and the self-defense forces. So for example, we see Japan attending RIMPAC in 1980 for the first time. This image is from 1984 RIMPAC, the Japanese destroyer. Japan in 1981 said it would commit to the sea lines of communications defense and other types of extraterritorial defense around Japan. This was something that was to a degree at the US urging. And it also made an exception to the arms export ban in 1983 for the United States. Japan and US were going to build a fighter jet together, essentially. The government got rid of the 1% GDP cap officially at least anyway, in 1986, and for a few years in the late 1980s, by something like 0.01% managed to exceed it. But nevertheless, officially the limit was gone. And in the late 1980s, we actually have discussion of Japan's self-defense forces going overseas for non-combat missions, especially minesweeping during the middle of the Iran-Iraq war. So this didn't happen, but the discussions were already in place when we had the Gulf War shock in the 1990s. And this was a place where Japan got a lot of criticism for so-called checkbook diplomacy. They provided a lot of money, but they didn't, in the sweat, so to speak, is what a lot of people here say. Well, they didn't sort of work up a sweat for the international community as such. And so Japan sort of, despite the generosity in terms of financial generosity, felt a sort of a status reduction there. And so a lot of elites in particular decided it was time to relax the no self-defense forces overseas ban. So we see, for example, minesweepers in the Indian Ocean, 1991, and self-defense force participation in United Nations peacekeeping operations from 1992. The no military use of space norm goes by the wayside as a surveillance satellite is agreed to in 1998 and put into space in the 2000s because of North Korea's missile testing. And we start to see further relaxation of the arms export restrictions, for example, for dual use exports in 1993. And again, 1996, we have the US-Japan joint declaration between President Clinton and Hashimoto Ryutaro, the Japanese Prime Minister. And this results in the revised US-Japan defense guidelines, originally created in 1978, and eventually a US-Japan AXA agreement in 1998. So an AXA agreement being the ability to basically swap equipment and services between militaries. So this was one of those examples of the firewall erected between the US and Japan military. Allies would normally be able to, swap or share these important sort of materials and services and so forth. But Japan decided that would not happen basically up until this point in time, at least on an official legal basis. So then this is the joint declaration in 1996. And we go into the 2000s. This declaration eventually resulted in a new law, which allows Japan to give support to the United States in areas surrounding Japan, even if Japan is not attacked itself. And so this would, of course, not be frontline combat. It would have to be rare area roles for the self-defense forces. And it would have to take this support to the United States would have to take place in so-called non-combat zones. Nevertheless, this legislation was the basis for so-called temporary laws, special measures laws passed after 9/11, which saw the self-defense forces participate in the Indian Ocean, replenishing American and I think other country ships, NATO ships, as well as in Iraq reconstruction missions, so-called non-combat missions. Although from this image in Samoa, it looks like they're pretty ready for combat. But nevertheless, this was considered a non-combat zone. So we start to see all of these things being chipped away at increasingly and in an accelerated way being salami slice. So self-defense force dispatch overseas natural disasters, okay. Anti-piracy cooperation, self-defense missions as far away as East Africa, okay. Ballistic missile defense exports, okay. And in fact, we even see a Ministry of Defense established and a change to a lot of rules about how civilians and the military can interact, also relaxed during this period. Now, in the 2010s, under the Democratic Party of Japan, it's usually seen as a bit of a sort of a black hole, but in terms of security policy, there was actually more going on than people realized. So for start off, the DPJ were the first ones to officially and openly question this idea of the basic defense force concept that we talked about, and it was promulgated in 1976. And instead, they started a discussion of what would be called dynamic defense in their version of the National Defense Program Guidelines. They made a decision to increase the capacity of submarines from 16 to 22. They made plans to establish an amphibious unit to defend outlying islands, which is something Japan had not done before. The Djibouti base was agreed before the DPJ, but they didn't stand in the way of it. And in fact, they allowed it to be established in 2011, Japan's first overseas base since World War II. And there was also a further and more thorough relaxation of the arms export ban in 2011. Okay. And of course, throughout the 2010s, we start to see a major uptick in the amount of training between Japan and non-US militaries throughout this period, which continues and is strengthened over time. Now, of course, Abe coming into power accelerated these incremental changes even further. We have a national security strategy for the first time in 2013. Further relaxation of arms exports, 2014, National Security Council and Secretariat about the same time. We have a further reinterpretation of the Constitution, which would allow Japan the so-called limited use of force to help allies when Japan is not under direct attack. Now, this would still be very highly circumscribed, so Japan would have to see itself in an existential crisis, so to speak. But nevertheless, technically speaking, it could be possible. And in 2015, and you can see this image it did give rise to a lot of controversy, but the peace and security legislation expands the range of situation that the self-defense forces can use weapons and also use force, which are slightly different ideas. But we now sort of see Japan self-defense force, in theory, discussion about Japan giving much more intimate support to allies if there was a contingency around, say, Taiwan or on the Korean Peninsula. So, to round this off, step change or more salami slicing ahead in the 2020s. Well, I think we'll see what happens. I think this needs to have a few years to sort of see how it goes, and there needs to be some political stability. But the possibility for a more thorough step change is maybe around the corner. So in December 2022, Japan announced its first post-war national defense strategy. Okay, it was 65 years in the making since the very general and broad basic defense policy in 1957, and it replaced the National Defense Program Guidelines, the one in 1976 that basically, positioned Japan as a peacetime force only. It represents an explicit return to this idea of the required defense force concept. What does that mean? Basically, what is the balance of power around Japan? What are the military capabilities of its rivals? What kind of threat do they pose to Japan will become at least explicitly an important part of Japan's defense planning going forward. Okay, and so to a certain degree, of course, Japan was doing this before anyway. They weren't obviously completely oblivious, but now it's going to be given a much more explicit place in the public communications around Japan's security policy. Okay, so this is basically what the National Defense Strategy itself says. And so it was also a accompanied by a defense build-up plan and a 5-year budget, which sort of looks at Japan's necessary capabilities 10 years into the future. And so the goal is to create a self-defense forces with a more credible warfighting capability. Japan's self-defense forces have capabilities, top-notch capabilities, professional members, but there were a lot of questions asked about whether it could really get involved in actual warfighting, in actual combat, and in particular sustain support, for example, for the United States, if there was any actual contingency. And the general answer everybody knew was no. It would probably have to bow out very quickly in any kind of high intensity conflict. This also demonstrated that Japan will now regularly exceed the 1% of GDP cap on defense spending. The big media focus was, of course, the development and acquisition of standoff weapons in larger quantities. And these weapons could, in theory, reach the Korean Peninsula and Chinese bases on the mainland. But also under the radar were, I think, probably even more important things, such as greater spending on maintenance, logistics, defense infrastructure, R&D for the defense industry, and so forth. These are things that have been a big problem for Japan. And even under the Abe government, which, reversed reductions in defense spending, you could actually argue Japan was buying less with more, so to speak. So I put this together up until 2020. If you look at the blue, that's the total change in nominal defense spending. The red is the change in maintenance expenses. So that's not total maintenance expenses, it's the change in maintenance expenses. So if you read this, basically between 2007 and 2020, in 7 out of 12 years, the increase in maintenance expenses was about the same or higher than the increase in the overall defense budget. So, this obviously was presenting huge problems for the sustainability of Japan's defense force platforms, keeping them in good condition, and very many other things. So to address all of that, we're starting to see an increase projected in defense. And this is defense spending, not all the sort of extra stuff they've put on top that's unrelated. This will go up over time as a percentage of government budget. As a percentage of GDP, I think it will get to something like 1.5% within a few years. Again, this is just purely defense spending and not broader spending on things like Coast Guard and stuff like that. And if we put it in terms of real growth in defense spending, we'll also see a slight uptick over time. Okay, so anyway, we're still seeing this playing out. We're having further discussion of arms exports. I won't go into this too deeply because it's not actually been resolved yet, but there's discussion about whether Japan should provide lethal weapons or military platforms with guns, I guess you could say, to support Ukraine, or when Japan and Italy and UK finally deliver their jet fighter in 2035, which I'm sure they will do, will they be able to export it outside of the three countries themselves and make some extra cash for Japan's defense industry, I guess. So anyway, the question of why now, to sort of tie things up, yeah, of course the salami slicing helped, but China and the pressure on Taiwan has also been quite significant and had a lot more play in Japan the last few years. In 2015, when Prime Minister Abe passed the legislation about Japan potentially helping the United States, he came up with all these very unusual scenarios, which didn't seem very realistic. But he was too afraid to talk about Taiwan and North Korea, which is not his fault, of course, but that was the sensitivity of the public at the time. Fast forward a few more years, talking about the defense of Taiwan is no longer even that remarkable in Japanese media circles and so forth. Not everyone agrees with it, of course, but it's not a big deal to talk about it. And I think, COVID-19 probably helped a little bit in that as well, because I guess Taiwan kind of won the PR war there, and it made people sort of a little bit more appreciative of Taiwan as a distinct society and controversially state. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a major and perhaps surprising driver of not so much change, but of changing public attitudes and increased, how should we say, permissiveness towards being open to changing Japan's security policy, spending more money and things like that. The diversification of its defense diplomacy has also helped. When it was just the United States, there was always this sort of idea or feeling that Japan was doing things because the United States told it to, right? Whether that was true or not is a different thing. But as Japan works out more with India, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, all of these other countries, it looks much less like a sort of a one-way thing. And Japan is being very constructive in its own way. And as important as Prime Minister Abe was about, in terms of leading change, there was always something that sort of seemed to turn the public off a little bit. And Prime Minister Abe himself realized this near the end, that if you focus too much on this idea of the constitution is bad and we need to get beyond the post-war regime and all of that sort of stuff, actually does turn off people in Japan a little bit, because they are open to constitutional change, have been so for 40 to 50 years. But the idea here is that they want to improve it, not necessarily take it to pieces as such. So I think Prime Minister Kishida is, with his background, is quite an important figure there for leading this change, because he didn't, he wasn't a lightning rod for the same kind of controversy that Prime Minister Abe was as well. So anyway, we can sort of talk about this more. This is probably not important. I got to sort of wind up here, but I'm happy to talk about and take questions about any of the particular points in this. And if you want me to explain a little bit more, I'm happy to do so. Thank you. Cool. And I went way over time.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace.
Sorry. Wow, I really made a big mistake there.
Dr. Wallace, we thank you so much for covering all of the points that encompasses Japan's security policy, because we do realize that the history of the Japanese security policy and perhaps where it's going covers a lot. So we thank you so much for covering that all for us today. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a Q&A session, but if anyone would like to stay longer, we can definitely take some questions. Even though we typically end at 11, if we're opening the floor to still accept questions and extend our Q&A session a couple more minutes. If anyone has some pressing questions they would like to ask Dr. Wallace for today, maybe perhaps 15 more minutes, if that's okay with you, Dr. Wallace.
Yep. Yeah. All good.
Okay. So to start off the Q&A, I have a question that I'd like to ask myself.
Sure.
So in the past, we've seen protests by Japanese young people over this, Article 9 and their preference for Japan maintaining like this peaceful image. Do you think Japanese people make some considerations if there's potential conflicts with, China or North Korea? Do you foresee them making a consideration with regards to those conflicts?
Yeah, so I mean, like the problem with protests in general is that they often a small percentage of the population that sort of stands out. So the messages promoted there may not be quite the same as those embraced by the general public. So of course, the Japanese public still remains kind of reserved and prefers military restraint as a sort of a general approach. But the idea that, that Japan and the United States will be the sole cause of a conflict, I think has weakened quite considerably amongst the younger generation in Japan. And so, yes, there's the protests with their, senso hantai, the we're against war sort of messages and so forth. But I don't think that necessarily sort of characterizes the general attitude of public more broadly as such. Even for those that are prefer military restraint and skeptical about whether Japan should actually strengthen the alliance or spend more money, so to speak. So, the opposition messages that you see, I think it's probably the same in the Okinawa sort of space as well. The messages you see in the process are not the same as the beliefs of the sort of broader public as such, even the ones who are opposed.
Thank you so much. So Jeff Maziata asks, it seems like we have a slow erosion of some of the long-held anti-war peace nation policies. Of course, as the region seems to be more and more antagonistic actions as the years go by, do you foresee Japan normalizing its defense policy as an unavoidable future, or can Japan reverse this trend?
But yeah, actually, I touched upon in my final slides, but I think we have to be careful of what's called the teleological fallacy. Like, just because we assume there's some kind of endpoint to all of this, but it can, as the Iraq War and the Vietnam Wars in the past showed, it can still call for reassurance, right? So what I was sort of arguing is that this erosion of the peace nation policies as such was related to the perception of whether assurance for both the public and externally was required or even helpful in the first place. So obviously with China these days, there's the perception that Japan can do anything to reassure China with the peace nation ideal. I don't think people believe that necessarily anymore, but they may have done so in the past. And so anyway, to get back to the idea of the normalizing of Japan's defense policy, I think the short answer is probably it will continue to, the restraints will continue to weaken based on current trends. But I don't necessarily think that's inevitable that Japan's security policy will be fully normalized. So there are still a number of areas such as what's called Kaigai Hahe, which is combat dispatch overseas. Obviously, the nuclear weapons issue is still a very live one in Japan, and many other areas. So if we are to get to a normal endpoint, I still think there's quite a bit of time and quite a few things that need to happen first. Yeah.
Thank you. Kiri Tagai asks, do you think the US would try to employ Japanese forces as part of its front line against China if any major conflict were to develop?
Sorry, one more time?
Yes, Kiri Tagai asks, do you think the US would try to employ Japanese forces as part of its front line against China if any major conflict were to develop?
So yeah, it depends on where the conflict takes place, obviously. So of course, around Japan's own territory. And I think realistically speaking, Taiwan, just geographically, it's kind of hard to separate that out and exclude cooperation. But I think under the current legislation, the idea that Japan's self-defense forces will be fighting at the forefront of anything except for the explicit defense of Japan is still a little bit hard to imagine. But there are plenty of things that just self-defense forces can do that would be very helpful to the United States that may not necessarily involve a major frontline contribution, but still the so-called rare area or in the logistics realm, very many other areas can be very helpful outside of the defense of Japan. But what I do think we're seeing, though, is a much more explicit emphasis on Japan being responsible for warfighting, a credible warfighting force for the defense of Japan itself. And if that happens to overlap into, say, like a Taiwan contingency, then so be it, I think. But as I said, like when we talk about the South China Sea and Middle East, I think things get a little bit more challenging there in terms of Japan's participation.
Thank you. I also want to kind of add to that question. So, um, if we don't really foresee or we don't know if Japan will kind of change as far as engaging in combat, if a situation were to happen with China, do you think the status of the US bases will change as Japan's security policy changes? Or do you
Hmm,
think even if there is no conflict with China or North Korea, for example, do you think that they will continue to remain as is?
it's hard for me to imagine a sort of a drawdown of the key bases that we have in Japan right now, especially the key air and naval force bases. Um, so I don't. There's not much of a sort of a push for that to happen. In terms of the actual, the status forces agreement and all of that sort of stuff, uh, it comes up from time to time, but I've not really seen any major um, sustained attempt to change the legislation. Sorry, change the rules around that. Such. Um, the main issue going forward, I think, is how the bases are distributed and how they align with the self-defense force spaces, how they're integrated with each other. Because as has been pointed out by some experts, Okinawa used to be great for the projection of power onto the Asian mainland when the US was the dominant power in the region. But now that might actually be a disadvantage if having everything all in one place, so to speak, although that's not actually true, but having a lot of stuff all in one place might be a disadvantage, and the uh, dispersal of bases might have to take place over the long term. But that raises other local political issues, which is a tough thing for the Japanese government to deal with, as Okinawa itself has shown.
Thank you. Um, so John Mensing asks, um, but I want to give you a bit of context first.
Yeah.
The term salami slicing has often been used to describe China's process of making incremental incursions in order to, um, I guess, create territorial expansionism. And so, with regard to the use of this term, um, what would you say, or how do you account in your analysis for China's threat to Japan's defense posture?
Uh, Quite considerably is the short answer there. As people in Japan are increasingly doing so. So I guess obviously I didn't have time to go into it. It took plenty as it was, but um, there has been a sort of a shift over the last couple of decades to being less permissive of so-called bad Chinese behavior in the military realm. Like even into the 1990s, there was still some permissiveness in the sense that there was nuclear weapons tests, there was the Taiwan Strait crisis, there was a quite clear commitment to military and naval modernization in China. Yet Japan was still investing a lot of ODA, some aid into China and for infrastructure during this period, including infrastructure that now is important for its China's military posture. So, over time, we've seen a much stricter and less sympathetic, I guess you could say, accounting of China's capabilities and its behavior in Japan's national security thinking. So certainly, in the same way that Japan has sort of salami sliced the military restraints, they're very aware of China's own salami slicing um, attempts and so forth to create new facts on the ground, as they say. So certainly that's been a big part of this, for sure.
You. This is our last question. Vivian Ning asked, do you think Japan's shift of attention to the Southwest will end up as a self-fulfilling prophecy that makes it look like a threat to China's claim over Taiwan, such as China feels its need to confront the SDF in the Southwest in order for its assert claim over Taiwan if it comes to such a situation, such as a declaration of independence by Taiwan?
Yeah, so this is the security dilemma in a nutshell. It's like will it make you safer? Will it improve deterrence, or will it just be a provocation that increases or pushes an adversary to remilitarize further? In this case, I don't think a sort of declaration of independence is something that even the Taiwanese necessarily want. So I don't really see that as a particular scenario of concern. In terms of whether China will adapt and see Japan's southwestern movement as a bit of a concern, I'm sure they will certainly say so. But currently, at this particular point in time, China has, vis-a-vis Japan solely, has such a major advantage that I think there's a long way to go before Japan can, on its own, present a reasonable threat. Now, of course, in the context of the US-Japan alliance, that's been sort of, I guess you could say, sort of discussed and haggled out right now, is, which has the upper hand. There's no doubt that there's tension there, and that it requires some smart diplomacy, as well as, I think, a robust commitment to deterrence by the US and Japan. But I don't necessarily think China responds to signals by Japan. It's more, I think, what the United States does that China is much more concerned about. Of course, on a sort of rhetorical level, what Japan does is quite useful for public consumption in China, the old enemy and everything that happened. But in terms of a direct reaction to Japan's military posture, I'm not so sure. We're talking about nuclear weapons and punishment by deterrence by punishment and all that sort of stuff. Maybe that changes the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wallace, for taking time out of your morning to be with us today. And
my apologies for the.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our audience who all have stuck with us for the the additional 15 minutes or so. We appreciate everyone's presence, and also for the question. And lastly, I want to thank our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York. And before we leave, I would like to share some upcoming events very quickly. So on Thursday, July 13th, we have a book talk. It's on the Imperfect Partners, the United States and Southeast Asia. This is a Zoom webinar, so if you have time, please join us for that event. Former Ambassador Scott Marcel will be the speaker for this event. So yeah, if you have time, please join us for this webinar on Thursday.
And then I can jump in and talk about this one if it's all right, because this is my series. We've got 2 community conversations coming up, obviously, and they're going to be back-to-back days. Community Conversations is our in-person series. So specifically on July 18th, we've got Dr. Yurika Ishii, and this is going to be in Yokosuka. Obviously, we're going to be looking at Japan Pacific Islands countries' cooperation in maritime law enforcement. We talked a little bit today about some of the regional issues that exist. So this could be a good look at how countries are approaching this, and especially looking at some of the other actors in the region besides Japan. Additionally, we will have, it's not advertised on it yet, but we will also be joined by Captain Kentaro Furuya, who's an adjunct professor at GRIPS, who's going to join us as a discussant on that talk, as Dr. Wallace has joined us as a discussant on previous talks. Then the next day on the 19th, we've got India and the Quad, the weakest link or necessary pivot. So this is going to be in Yokota, Fusa area. So please, if you're in Fusa, come join us. We've got Dr. Yogesh Joshi. We're very excited to have him come out. He's in Japan for some other conferences, and we've been lucky enough that he's going to join us for this great talk in Fusa. We'll have refreshments at both events. So come on by, have some free food. I think we'll have some wings and pizza in Yokosuka, and we'll have maybe some gelato in Fusa. I don't know. We'll see. Show up and enjoy the talk with us. All right. Thanks, Amani. I'll shift it back over to you.
And the final event I want to share with you all is the next Getting to Know Japan webinar. It's going to be on Japan Middle East relations. This will be next Thursday, July 20th at 1900. Dr. Vanessa Abu Khalil will be our speaker for this event. So as usual for our webinars, please register. And if you would like to find more information, please go to the YCAP's website. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate you all coming, and we hope to see you again next week. Thank you so much, Dr. Wallace, for your time today, and see you next time. Thank you. Bye.